Can a wild Mustang truly feel the pain of a human being? What would make such a free creature approach Helen, a woman unable to move on her own? This story will make you rethink unspoken bonds and how hearts can align even from a distance. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. No more waiting, the story begins right now. Helen Carter had lived on the edge of the Great Plains for decades. Her little home was a refuge of memories, filled with pictures of a time when she had been an equestrian, riding horses with a grace that mesmerized everyone. But everything changed 20 years ago, after a car accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. Now, at 78, her connection with horses was limited to watching the wild Mustangs that roamed the open plains from her porch. Helen's days were predictable. Her granddaughter, Sophia, visited weekly to bring groceries and keep her company. But most of the time, Helen was alone, her heart longing for the freedom she once knew. The Great Plains stretched endlessly beyond her backyard, a reminder of what was lost in the wild beauty that still thrived. One crisp morning, as Helen wheeled herself outside to enjoy the gentle sun, she noticed something unusual. A lone Mustang stood at the edge of her property. Unlike the others that usually stayed far from human dwellings, this one was closer, too close. Its dark, shiny coat glistened under the sunlight, and its eyes, sharp and curious, seemed to lock onto hers. At first, Helen froze. Wild horses didn't approach people. They avoided them. But this Mustang didn't move away. Instead, it stepped cautiously forward, its hooves crunching the dry grass. Helen felt her pulse quicken. She clutched the arms of her wheelchair, her breath catching as the Mustang came within 20 feet of her. "What are you doing here?" she murmured softly, her voice trembling. The horse flicked its ears as though it understood her words. Helen's heart ached as she watched the creature, so free, so full of life, standing before her. A pang of envy surged through her. She had spent 2 decades yearning for the kind of freedom this Mustang represented. The moment was broken when the Mustang suddenly turned and bolted, disappearing over the hill as it had appeared. Helen sat there, her hands trembling. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of wonder, a flicker of the spirit she thought she'd lost. When Sophia arrived later that day, Helen recounted the encounter. "A wild horse came up to me," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Sophia laughed gently, assuming it was another one of her grandmother's vivid memories of the past. "Maybe it was just a dream, Grandma." But Helen knew it wasn't a dream. That Mustang had come to her for a reason, and deep down she felt that their story wasn't over. The following morning, Helen wheeled herself out to her usual spot on the porch. The sun was just rising, casting a warm orange glow over the endless plains. She scanned the horizon, her heart silently hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious Mustang. Hours passed, and the day carried on as usual, quiet and uneventful. But just as Helen was about to return inside, she heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of hooves against the ground. Her breath caught as she turned her gaze toward the Great Plains. There it was, the same Mustang from the day before. The horse approached slowly, its movements cautious but deliberate. Helen's heart pounded. She had seen many wild horses over the years, but none had ever shown this level of curiosity or boldness. This time the Mustang came even closer, stopping mere feet away from her porch. It stood there, its eyes studying her as though trying to understand the frail woman before it. Helen reached out instinctively, her hand trembling. "Hey there," she whispered. The Mustang didn't move but flared its nostrils, breathing in her scent. The connection between them felt almost tangible, as if the horse recognized something in Helen that others could not. This time the Mustang didn't bolt. Instead, it lingered, grazing nearby while keeping her in its peripheral vision. Helen sat in silence, her eyes welling with tears. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as a frail old woman in a wheelchair, but as someone worthy of attention and connection. As the days passed, the Mustang began appearing more frequently. Each visit brought it closer to Helen's porch, and she began leaving out small buckets of water for it. She nicknamed the horse Midnight because of its sleek, dark coat that seemed to blend with the dusk. Sophia, however, remained skeptical when Helen shared her experiences. Wild horses don't just walk up to people, Grandma. Are you sure you're not imagining things? Helen smiled knowingly. Sometimes the wild recognizes the broken Sophia, and maybe it sees something in me that you don't. But not everyone in the village viewed Midnight's presence with the same reverence as Helen did. A local rancher, Jack, had spotted the horse near his cattle. That Mustang's trouble, he warned Helen one afternoon. They spook the herds, and if it starts hanging around here, someone's bound to go after it. Helen's chest tightened. She knew the dangers wild Mustangs faced, being captured or worse, killed for wandering too close to human territory. Midnight was no exception, and the thought of losing this unexpected connection filled her with dread. That evening, Helen sat on her porch watching the Great Plains. Midnight appeared once more, this time venturing closer than ever. As Helen looked into the horse's eyes, she felt a deep resolve. If the world was against Midnight, she would do everything in her power to protect him, even if it meant going against the very people she had called neighbors for decades. Midnight's visits became a daily occurrence. Each morning, Helen wheeled herself to the porch, her heart lifting the moment she saw the dark figure against the golden plains. The Mustang's cautious nature began to soften, and Helen found herself speaking to him in the same tender voice she once used with her beloved horses years ago. "Good morning, Midnight," she said one sunny afternoon, holding out a carrot in her wrinkled hand. Midnight hesitated at first, his ears flicking back and forth as he assessed the situation. Then slowly and deliberately, he stepped forward, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the offered treat. Helen held her breath, afraid that the slightest movement might scare him off. But to her amazement, Midnight took the carrot from her hand, his soft lips brushing against her palm. Helen's laughter rang out, pure and unrestrained, echoing across the Great Plains. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years, a laugh born of joy, not of politeness or obligation. Midnight stayed close that day, grazing in the yard as Helen sat and watched, her heart swelling with the sense of purpose she thought she'd lost long ago. Word of the wild Mustang's unusual behavior began to spread through the small town. Neighbors stopped by, curious about the stories they'd heard. Some marveled at the bond between Helen and Midnight, while others, like Jack the rancher, saw the horse as a nuisance. "That animal doesn't belong here, Helen," Jack said one afternoon, his voice stern. "You're just encouraging him to stay, and that's not good for anyone. Wild horses need to be out there, not hanging around people." Helen met his gaze, her own, steady and unwavering. "He's not bothering anyone, Jack. He's just looking for something. And so am I." Despite Jack's warnings, Helen continued to nurture her bond with Midnight. She began leaving out hay and fresh water, setting up a small area near the porch where the horse could safely rest. Midnight's trust in her grew with each passing day, and soon he allowed her to stroke his neck, her frail fingers tracing the contours of his powerful muscles. For Helen, these moments were more than just a connection to a wild animal. They were a lifeline. Each touch, each gentle nicker from Midnight seemed to erase years of loneliness and pain. In him, she saw a reflection of her own spirit, wild, untamed, and yearning for freedom, despite the odds. But the peace between Helen and Midnight was short-lived. One afternoon, as Midnight grazed near the house, a loud engine roared in the distance. Helen's heart sank as she recognized the sound of Jack's truck pulling up the driveway. He stepped out, his expression grim. "Helen, I've warned you. That horse has been spotted near my cattle again. If he causes any trouble, the authorities won't think twice about taking him down, and I won't be able to stop them." Helen's voice wavered, but her resolve was firm. "Midnight isn't causing trouble, Jack. He's just lost, like so many of us are." Jack sighed, shaking his head. "You can't save every wild thing, Helen. Sometimes it's just the way of the world." That night, Helen sat on her porch, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. Midnight stood nearby, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. As she watched him, a tear slipped down her cheek. She had spent so many years feeling powerless, but now for the first time, she had something worth fighting for. A week later, the calm of the Great Plains was shattered by dark clouds rolling in from the horizon. The air was heavy, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain. Helen sat on her porch, watching the sky darken, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. Midnight hadn't visited yet that day, and unease gnawed at her. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Helen's worry deepened. Midnight's visits had become so regular that his absence now felt like a missing piece of her day. By the time the storm hit in full force, with wind howling and rain lashing against her windows, she could barely sit still. The Great Plains, usually a picture of serenity, now looked menacing under the flashing lightning. Helen wheeled herself closer to the window, her heart pounding with fear for the wild horse. She had no way of knowing if Midnight had found shelter or if he was braving the storm out in the open. The night stretched on, the storm showing no signs of relenting. Helen barely slept, her thoughts consumed by Midnight. At dawn, the rain finally eased, leaving the Great Plains soaked and glistening. She hurried to the porch, scanning the landscape for any sign of her companion. Her breath caught when she spotted him. Midnight was limping, his dark coat matted with mud and water. He was moving slowly, his usual grace replaced by a painful shuffle. Helen's heart broke at the sight. Without thinking, she called out to him, "Midnight, over here!" The Mustang's ears perked up at her voice. Despite his injury, he hobbled toward her, each step a visible struggle. When he finally reached the porch, Helen saw the cause of his limp, a deep gash on his front leg, likely from debris thrown around by the storm. Helen's hands trembled as she wheeled herself closer to him. "Oh, Midnight," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're hurt." She knew she couldn't leave him like this, but treating a wild horse was no small task. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against his damp coat. Midnight flinched at first, but he didn't retreat. Taking it as a sign of trust, Helen grabbed a clean towel and some antiseptic from the house. She worked carefully, her movements gentle as she cleaned the wound. Midnight stood still, his dark eyes watching her with an almost human intensity. As she worked, Helen realized how fragile this connection was. Midnight was a creature of the wild, and any prolonged contact with humans could put him at risk. Yet here he was, trusting her in a moment of vulnerability. The news of Midnight's injury spread quickly through the village. Some neighbors expressed concern, while others, like Jack, saw it as further proof that the Mustang was a liability. "You can't keep nursing that horse, Helen," Jack warned. "If he gets dependent on you, he'll lose what makes him wild. And if he starts wandering near people, someone's going to report him." Helen refused to listen. "He came to me because he needed help," she said firmly. "Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Help when we can?" The following days were a test of both Helen's resolve and Midnight's strength. She tended to his wound as best as she could, even enlisting Sophia's help to bring fresh hay and water closer to the house. Midnight's limp began to improve, but Helen knew the clock was ticking. The longer he stayed, the more likely it was that someone would take action against him. One evening, as Helen sat on the porch with Midnight grazing nearby, she made a silent vow. She would protect him no matter what. Even if it meant confronting the village or risking her own safety, she couldn't let Midnight pay the price for simply existing. Midnight's recovery was steady but slow. His limp lessened with each passing day, and Helen's bond with him grew stronger. Every morning she would find him waiting near the porch, his dark coat gleaming under the rising sun. Helen's days, once marked by loneliness, were now filled with purpose. Midnight had reignited a spark within her, and for the first time in years she felt truly alive. But not everyone shared her joy. Jack's warnings had escalated into outright threats. "Helen," he said one afternoon, standing on her porch with his hat in hand, "the county's been hearing complaints about a Mustang hanging too close to human property. They're sending a team out next week to round him up." The words hit Helen like a punch to the gut. "Round him up? You mean take him to one of those holding facilities?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack sighed, his expression softening. "It's for the best, Helen. Wild horses can't stay near people. It's dangerous, for them and for us." Helen shook her head, her grip tightening on the arms of her wheelchair. "He's not dangerous, Jack. He's just trying to survive, like the rest of us." But deep down, she knew the odds were stacked against her. Wild Mustangs captured by authorities were often placed in overcrowded holding pens or sold off to questionable buyers. The thought of Midnight losing his freedom was unbearable. That evening, Helen sat on her porch, staring out at the Great Plains. Midnight stood nearby, his strong, graceful form silhouetted against the fading light. She couldn't bear the idea of him being taken away. But what could she, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, possibly do to stop it? The answer came unexpectedly the next day. Sophia arrived for her weekly visit, and Helen shared the news about the roundup. To her surprise, Sophia didn't dismiss her concerns. Instead, she listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. "What if we moved him somewhere safer?" Sophia suggested. "There's that wildlife sanctuary a few towns over. They have land set aside for Mustangs. It's not the wild, but it's better than a holding pen." Helen's eyes lit up with hope. "You think they'd take him?" "I can call and find out," Sophia said, already pulling out her phone. The sanctuary's response was encouraging. They agreed to take Midnight, provided he could be safely transported. But the logistics were daunting. Catching and moving a wild horse was no easy feat, and Helen knew Midnight wouldn't trust anyone else the way he trusted her. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning. Sophia arranged for a horse trailer and enlisted the help of a local veterinarian to ensure Midnight's safety during transport. Helen, meanwhile, spent as much time as possible with Midnight, preparing him for the journey. She spoke to him softly, explaining what was about to happen, even though she wasn't sure he could understand. When the day of the move arrived, the tension was palpable. The vet and Sophia worked carefully to guide Midnight toward the trailer, using gentle coaxing and Helen's presence to keep him calm. Midnight's unease was clear. His ears flicked back and forth, and he's jack-ped the ground nervously. "It's okay, boy," Helen said from her wheelchair, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "You're going to a place where you'll be safe, I promise." After what felt like an eternity, Midnight stepped into the trailer. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and Helen felt a pang of guilt. She had done what she thought was best, but the sight of Midnight confined in the trailer was almost too much to bear. As the trailer pulled away, Helen sat on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The plane stretched out before her, now empty and quiet. A single tear slid down her cheek. She had fought for Midnight, but the weight of their parting was heavier than she had anticipated. As the trailer disappeared over the horizon, Helen's porch felt emptier than it had in years. Midnight's presence had filled a void she hadn't realized was so deep. Now she sat alone, grappling with the bittersweet mix of relief and loss. She had fought to save him, but the price of doing so was a parting she wasn't ready for. Sophia called later that day to reassure her. "Grandma, Midnight's going to be fine. The sanctuary is beautiful. Rolling hills, plenty of space to roam. He'll be happy there." Helen nodded, though Sophia couldn't see her through the phone. "I know it's the right thing," she said softly, "but it doesn't make it easier." That night, sleep didn't come easily. Helen's mind replayed the moment Midnight stepped into the trailer, his dark eyes filled with trust and uncertainty. She wondered if he felt betrayed, if he would forgive her for sending him away. The following days were a blur of silence. Helen's routine returned to its old rhythm, but nothing felt the same. The Great Plains, once alive with Midnight's presence, seemed vast and hollow. She missed the sound of his hooves, the gentle way he grazed nearby, and the connection they had shared. Then, a week after Midnight's departure, Sophia arrived with unexpected news. "The sanctuary invited us to visit," she said with a smile. "They want you to see how he's doing." Helen's heart leapt. The thought of seeing Midnight again filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in days. "When can we go?" she asked eagerly. The trip was arranged for the following weekend. Sophia helped Helen into the car, her wheelchair securely packed in the trunk. As they drove, Helen stared out at the landscapes, her thoughts consumed by Midnight. Would he remember her? Would he still trust her after everything? The sanctuary was nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. As they pulled into the driveway, Helen's breath caught. The sight of open pastures filled with grazing Mustangs was breathtaking. A staff member greeted them warmly and led them to Midnight's enclosure. Helen's hands trembled with anticipation as they approached, and then she saw him. Midnight stood near the edge of the fence, his dark coat gleaming in the sunlight. He was no longer limping, and his stance had regained the proud, confident air of a wild horse. Helen's eyes filled with tears as she wheeled closer. "Midnight," she called softly. The Mustang's ears twitched, and he turned toward her. For a moment, he stood still, as if processing the sound of her voice. Then, to everyone's amazement, he walked toward her, his steps slow but deliberate. Helen extended her hand, her heart pounding as Midnight lowered his head. His soft muzzle brushed against her palm, and the tears she had been holding back spilled freely. "You remember me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The staff member smiled. "He's been thriving here, but it's clear you have a special bond with him." Helen spent hours with Midnight that day, speaking to him in the same tender voice she always had. She stroked his neck, feeling the strength of the creature she had fought so hard to protect. When it was time to leave, Helen's heart ached, but it was different this time. She knew Midnight was safe, free to live as he was meant to. As she said her goodbyes, she whispered, "Be happy, Midnight. You'll always have a piece of my heart." As Helen and Sophia drove home from the sanctuary, the silence in the car was different this time. It wasn't the heavy quiet of loneliness, but a peaceful stillness, filled with the satisfaction of knowing Midnight was safe. For the first time in years, Helen felt like she had truly made a difference. The days that followed were brighter. Helen spent her mornings on the porch, not waiting for Midnight to appear, but simply enjoying the beauty of the Great Plains. She still missed him, of course, but the knowledge that he was thriving brought her a quiet joy. She began writing in a journal, documenting her time with Midnight and the lessons he had taught her about resilience, trust, and the power of connection. Word of Helen's bond with Midnight spread through the small town. Neighbors who once dismissed her stories now stopped by to ask about the Mustang. Even Jack, the gruff rancher who had once viewed Midnight as a nuisance, paid her a visit. "I heard you got him into that sanctuary," he said, tipping his hat. "Guess I was wrong about you two. Took guts to do what you did." Helen smiled, her eyes twinkling. "He taught me more about courage than I ever could have taught him." Sophia, inspired by her grandmother's journey, began volunteering at the sanctuary on weekends. She would return with stories of Midnight, who had become something of a legend among the staff. "They say he's a leader," Sophia told Helen one evening. "He's always the first to explore new pastures, and the other horses follow him. It's like he knows he's free." Helen's heart swelled with pride. She knew Midnight had always been special, and hearing about his thriving life at the sanctuary was the reassurance she needed. One day, Sophia suggested hosting a small fundraiser to support the sanctuary. Helen eagerly agreed, offering to share her story as part of the event. The gathering was held in her backyard, with neighbors, friends, and even some sanctuary staff in attendance. Helen sat in her wheelchair, looking out at the familiar faces. She took a deep breath and began. "I spent years feeling trapped by my circumstances, my body, and my own mind. But then a wild Mustang came into my life. Midnight reminded me that freedom isn't just about where you are, it's about how you choose to live." Her words moved the crowd, and by the end of the evening, they had raised enough funds to help care for several more Mustangs at the sanctuary. Helen felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that Midnight's story was making a difference far beyond her own life. As the seasons changed, Helen's connection with Midnight remained strong. Sophia often took her to visit the sanctuary, where Midnight would greet her with the same gentle nuzzle. Each visit reinforced the unspoken bond between them, a bond that had transcended the boundaries of species and circumstance. On a crisp autumn morning, Helen sat on her porch, watching the golden sunlight stretch across the Great Plains. She thought about Midnight, running free in the sanctuary's vast pastures, leading his herd with the same strength and grace that had drawn her to him in the first place. A smile spread across her face as she whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Midnight, for reminding me what it means to truly live." Helen's life had been changed forever by a wild Mustang, and though their time together had been brief, the lessons he had left behind would echo in her heart for the rest of her days. Helen and Midnight's story is a testament to the unbreakable bonds that can form between humans and animals. Their connection wasn't just about survival, it was about finding hope, healing, and courage in the face of life's challenges. Midnight's journey to safety and freedom reflected Helen's own rediscovery of purpose and resilience. The story of Helen and Midnight is more than just an extraordinary bond between human and animal. It's a living testament to the power of resilience and hope. Despite the difficult path life had placed before her, despite facing loneliness and pain, Helen discovered an inner strength and connections that seemed impossible. Midnight, the wild Mustang, brought new faith to her, a spark in her heart she thought had long extinguished. This not only changed her life, but also encourages us to reflect on the value of unspoken connections, of fateful encounters. This story speaks to not only animal lovers, but also carries a profound message about perseverance, courage, and the ability to survive against all odds. We can learn so much from Helen and Midnight's story, the power of connection, the healing that we can find even in the most seemingly hopeless situations. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. Share these inspiring stories with your friends and family to spread love and kindness. We will continue to bring you magical stories, powerful messages of love, hope, and strength to overcome any challenge. Join us on this incredible journey